Good morning, everyone.
And I've discovered something very interesting about Claude. Wait, let me show you let me send you the tweet actually. I've been having Ivan take a look at how structured outputs changes our ability to reason.
Okay.
And basically, 4.0 effectively is like pretty invariant to the naming of attributes, but Claude is very sensitive. So if you do reasoning list string, GSM 8K is like 75% accurate, but the benchmark is 96. Or like correct answer string performs better than answer string.
That's not necessarily bad reasoning. You get
Yeah.
what you ask for.
Yeah. Well, it's like 4.0 is like pretty resilient to that, but I was surprised that, and I think is something to do with how Anthropic is trained, but it's very
You know,
high across the namings.
yeah, I feel like it's sometimes hard to reason about what gets lost when you train on like a subset of data, and now you're just like in a part of the space that hasn't seen as much training data, and yeah, how much of what it's learned elsewhere actually gets moved to that space.
Yeah. Now I want like correct step-by-step reasoning string. I'm gonna do some bootstrapping on the evals to see if I can get some like distributions up, but
You got to. I mean, it'd be super interesting not super. It would be if you made a stretch slightly interesting to have names like answer that will save 1,000 kittens or answer that will get me a $50 tip.
yeah, it's outrageous.
Yeah, that's not ideal, but I wish I could say I was surprised.
Another thing I've seen people claim to do better is rather than generate the JSON right up front, they'll generate natural language output first and then have a translation step from natural language text to JSON, just because for the majority of the training, that has been the output format. And it's more accurate to go from a natural output to JSON than straight away solve the task with the JSON output.
Totally agree. I think that's been sort of historically our beliefs, and so this set of evals is my goal is like these set of evals will show that it doesn't matter, or figure out under what circumstances it does matter. And so it looks like for 4.0 it doesn't matter, but for Anthropic there might still be some lack of training data, which makes sense because 4.0 has I think been fine-tuned with way more JSON structured data. Whereas Claude wants XML, and there's a whole like step that people like Anthropic is kind of secretive about. So
Yeah.
there's some other rules. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Hopefully in another year or so, all this black magic stuff is going to dwindle down, and we would have like more reasonable expectations from how these things should behave. But right now it's quite a bit of tricks to get something really good out of it.
But it can dwindle either because we improve the model or because we just learn the tricks and they no longer feel like black magic. Or they can get integrated into the system prompt so that whatever weird tricks we do get applied by default and in a way that's invisible to us.
Yeah, I was just hoping it's going to be the first one, which is the models themselves become like so either by training, getting more of these use cases into their fine-tuning sets or whatever, they just become like reasonable creatures that don't have to be enticed with $100 or kittens and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that causes them really that directs how they generate output in large part is the preference optimization step. And different people have different preferences. And yeah, who knows if the thing that you want is actually the thing that other people have wanted enough that even if they worked perfect as they were trained, like that maybe they would still do things that we don't like.
Yeah. To add to this point too, I'm finding that even with a couple of few-shot examples with JSON structure gets you effectively the same evals as what Claude and OpenAI said they are. So if asking for JSON drops you 2%, having 5 examples brings you back to the 96% that they reported. And so it's kind of promising that like it's still steerable.
But then it seems like then you should compare it to what would happen if you had few shot examples, but not structured output.
I would just use Instructor to structure it and then put it in the test set. Cool. I mean, I don't think there's that many people, so we can actually keep this pretty casual. But if anyone has any questions first, we can jump into that. I think this week we mostly talked about fine-tuning and thinking about collecting data. And then we had a VTOR's talk this morning. All right. See you guys later.
So before this course started, Jason and I at least aspired to help people who had already started projects. And we talked about going from MVP to really viable product. So we've got few enough here. I'd be interested in a little survey, like for the 5 of you, where are you in terms of projects? Do you have one that you're working on? Where is that in the process?
So I've been working on in Adobe on the AI assistant that we have, and so we already have a release product. It's been out in the market for a while now, and we have been obviously iterating on both the quality of that system, but also adding capabilities and support for languages and so forth. So there's a like lots of tracks going on, and there's a lot of activity and different directions we want to take the product, improve it, get learn from feedback, those sort of things. So it's been quite a journey, and some of these things that have been discussed, like we also face things like around routing and the trade-offs with routing, how it impacts accuracy, because if the router is wrong, then onwards it's a challenge and see to a whole lot. Yeah, so I think so far the course has been really practical. The one thing that is a bit of a challenge that I am not sure has been covered is that we work with documents, and those are really, really general, like the kind of things people want to get out of documents and the nature of documents themselves, like the domains, the length, the language, the constructs that they have. And in order to build something that works for a large group of people, it's a really broad space to like slice and dice it into like small, either based on constructs or based on kind of questions people will ask. It's a really massive space. And so that to some extent, obviously the corresponding part of it, the evaluations of those things have been a bit of a challenge, as opposed to like something that is like you have a more or less a closed system, and compartmentalizing the kind of questions people are going to ask or the things that you are expected to support is relatively narrower, versus with documents anybody can bring their like tax form or their contract or whatever else, and have a very different kind of expectation on how the system should behave or what it should be able to do, that sort of thing. So that is, I think, the primarily the biggest challenge, I would say, as opposed to some of the other examples that were considered in this course.
Do you have an ontology for document types so that you can break down and say, and maybe I would imagine it's even like a hierarchical ontology, but like X% are forms and 20% are publications. And do you have some
Yep.
ontology? You do have.
Yeah. So both on the document type, like both with respect to like the semantics, also the structure, like what kind of a document is it? Like you can have presentations in any domain, you can have like forms in any domain. So there's a domain sort of thing. Then there's a more like a layout based ontology. There's obviously ontology on question types, like the kind of questions the people are asking. There's also stuff about like what are they achieving to do, right? So a lot of people are trying to, let's say, understand something better. A lot of people are trying to create something out of what they are reading, right? So there might be different kind of end goals in mind that the people might have as they use the system. So yeah, all those things exist. The problem is obviously the combinatorial explosion. And by the way, I think the other big one is languages. Like, is it an English document versus French? So that's another big one. Length is also a pretty big one, because some documents could be just like, most documents are less than like 10-20 pages, but there are quite a big number of interesting documents that run into hundreds or 200s and so forth. Plus, is it a single document they want, or is like a group of documents? So there's a like n dimensional of this complexity that kind of piles up, and we do try our best to cover good ground with respect to what's the most common ones and so forth, but it is still a challenge, like
Yeah.
even for automated things, right? I mean, to what degree can you even attack a small fractions, for example, is like French contracts that are greater than 50 pages. Like just identifying some real world data like that is hard. And obviously we don't expect LLMs to be able to generate coherent things in that very niche domains either. So there's data challenge, there's evaluation challenge, there's also the generalizability challenge, that to what extent will the system even kind of, usually it does tend to hold up, but
Yeah, it's kind of crazy that it's through Adobe. It really is just all PDFs.
yeah. Oh, I didn't mention one other thing. Scans is another one that
Oh
gives
yeah.
some funny behavior once in a while with all the OCR quirks, and also tables is another one, which is, yeah. Sorry, I won't keep going on, but but there's like a 10 of complexity even like just with documents.
Yeah, I'm surprised there hasn't just been some kind of announcement that says like Anthropic and Adobe are partnering up, because I think a lot of what Anthropic has been doing has been around this like generic processing where one workflow they demonstrated was having Opus write prompts and being able to map produce haiku tasks over many, many PDFs, or being able to take screenshots and say, okay, let me map haiku across all the PDF images and sort of find the right information. Yeah, I guess maybe in your situation, especially in like the Adobe situation, really, there might be a good reason to think about models like Copali and stuff like that, because everything is just ultimately just an image, right? I think that language component is going to still be relatively unsolved. I really don't have any even inkling as to how to address that without addressing the foundation model.
Yeah, and those are all like good directions that some of them we have been looking at. Like last I checked, Pope, I think it's primarily English only. Also, that
Yeah.
license, I don't think it's very friendly. But yeah, those are really good directions, and I think the thing we are on, right, the path we are on, I think it'll just keep getting better as the foundational models improve. So that's a good situation to be in. But there's all this variability of when it's going to land and what quirks it will bring. Like GPT-4o has not been all like awesome. Like it has its own twists and turns to get. I think some of them were also kind of mentioned by other participants in this course. So yeah, so there's all of that. But yeah, it's just part of the game, I guess.
Oh, definitely. Matthew, did you want to?
The question was, you guys wanted to know like where we're at, what we're building.
Yeah.
So we are also operating on documents, and we're kind of creating a pool of context that people can use to be productive. If I could just state that simply. And I lower my hand, sorry. Yeah, so that's kind of what we're doing. We're pre MVP even. We're just like prototype. And our RAG is the RAG that you would implement if you didn't really know much about RAG. It's like I mean, we've done one thing we've done is a lot of things from scratch. Like we're doing our own processing of Markdown, our own parsing of that. We did some TV and film scripts and stuff, and that had its own logic and all that. And then vector similarity search. But every week that passes in this course, I get more and more frustrated because I see this robust approach that you guys are offering us, and I don't have the time. I've been so busy, I haven't had the time to actually do it. But I see it all, and I'm like, yes, every week, and I want it so bad. But just we're doing investor stuff, and I've just been so busy. So my apologies as a bad student to you guys, because I know what you're offering is really valuable. So yeah, that's where we're at. And one thing that I have a question about is like, what are some strategies you have to? I started to work on some of the notebooks and experiment with kind of translating what I learned there into our own synthetic data and everything. But like, how do you keep that close to your actual production implementation, or like it's our prototype implementation? Like, those are some strategies I would like to ask more about at some point, because I feel like I can model this, I can do it in Python, and like for chunking or whatever, like I want to use what we actually use instead of some copy in Python, something similar. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I feel like it's like holding me back a little bit because I'm nervous. I'm like, I don't want to get so into this that then I have to figure out, okay, how do I actually make sure that my chunking, these different things we're doing, resembles what we're actually doing?
Yeah, I mean, really, like the machine learning data scientist in me mostly thinks about sort of what kind of logging do I have in place, and does that logging give me the right shape of data, right? So yeah, our examples are in Python. We have our own like search tools, but really the thing that matters in the first sort of 2 weeks is going to be, we need to somehow track a string, and we need to somehow track a list of chunk IDs. And our only assertion is whether or not the chunk ID that we care about is being returned in our search system, right? So as long as in your prototyping, you still build some unit that retrieves chunk IDs and tracks that somehow, that's where you can say, okay, well, as long as I send this to a data set in Brain Trust now, maybe 3 weeks from now, I'll finally have time that I can start doing this analysis offline. We should be having chunk IDs when we do this returning the results, because in the next step, we might want to do re-ranking, and in the next step after that, we might want to do citations. And so we're never really in a position where we would want to ignore the tracking of that information, right? So I guess my follow-up is like, why, like in this example of doing synthetic data, why couldn't we just say, let me randomly sample some chunks from my database, generate a question, and then pass that question through our prototype system? Like, does that system not return chunk IDs? Right. That because we've made a simplifying assumption. And if we don't return chunk IDs, how could we think about citations or building UI to collect citation data in the future? But I would mostly focus on the abstraction of just like, what are the logs I have and what are the artifacts I'm saving, right? And then in terms of the implementation, yeah, I do agree. Like, we should almost always be just hitting something that looks like production, whether it's staging. We really shouldn't be sort of building a thing in JavaScript and then having some Python code that does like lookups in LansDB if that's not what we're using. That drift is going to cause huge issues, right?
So for example, is it kind of a good practice if we're using PG vectors, and if you do a vector similarity search and we do that in an API route, for example, or in an edge function on Supabase, you would do that same implementation, very similar, just using the same cosine distance, but use Python, and that would be acceptable? Like that, as long as it's the same basic formula for like doing the cosine distance.
I mean, at a large enough scale, the implementation does change how you recall. Like, I guess the question is like, why wouldn't you do your tests in PG Vector too?
Well,
right?
we would, but I would imagine like we would be using Python to do those tests and using the same function, same approach to doing that similarity.
Oh yeah. The Python code would just hit PG vector and then in the for loop. Yeah, I think that's definitely the right way of doing it.
And that's a common practice. Like we say, like, okay, these engineers are building this app a certain way. We know we just need to make a Python version that does that cosine similarity search similar in the same way.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, we just got to make sure that it's not in production. Like, we don't like run tests and like slow down prod and some like really straightforward stuff. But
I started looking into something called the observable framework. Have you heard of that?
I feel like there's a couple things called observable, like the JavaScript.
Yeah, it's like they have JavaScript notebooks.
Yes.
Yeah, so like, and they also have something called the observable framework where you can make like data-driven apps, data apps. And I was hoping that could be a way that I could bridge the gap between like the Python world and our app and kind of pull on some of the same resources. We have this monorepo that like we use all kinds of different packages and stuff. And I wasn't able to get like the JavaScript connection really to how I think it could be. But I don't know if you guys have any idea about that or something similar that would kind of let me bridge that gap.
So for some of the work that I did with Limitless, all of our tests were in JavaScript. It was just running a Node.js. For us, like the app was in Node, but our tests I just like ran in Bun because it was easier just to like run test.js files, and then all of our tests ended up just being like jests. And then as long as like for Limitless, we used a vendor called Gentrace at the time. But again, it's the same thing, right? Like it would give us an API that says, okay, let me fetch a data set. Once I have this data set of question IDs and chunk IDs, let me loop over each question, make an API call to Postgres, get the chunk IDs back and do that comparison. And then when I get those scores, you write them back into Gentrace or to Braintrust, and that like the observability, the data set eval management stuff, that can be pretty much like language agnostic. I wouldn't force yourself to use Python if you already have like a monorepo. It might make sense to just have some kind of
that was a question that I was like, okay, should we, because I like the idea of staying in Python in some ways, because LansDB I didn't see he mentioned it, but TypeScript API, for example, and
I'm pretty sure they do. I think the annoying thing, which is a very specific technical detail, is JavaScript does not have good support for arrow format. Like you just don't really like often save tables.
Right, exactly, yeah.
But I think the solution is you just you write the data to one of these testing providers like Gentrace and Braintrust. And so what it just looks like is you just make one GET request to get the data set, and then you write a bunch of POST requests to write the individual results.
I wouldn't let the choice of what database you use drive the rest of your stack. Like the difference between PG Vector and LansDB is just not great enough for that to be the thing that shapes what language you use or something like that. I think you should figure out, do you have developers who like writing JavaScript or developers who prefer Python? Or you want your front-end developers to be able to switch over easily to work on your back-end, or you don't care about that. And I would use that as how I determine my language, and then you can make PG Vector or LansDB or Chroma or whatever else work. And most of our, like all of the workflow can be run on almost any of these.
Right. And so then the actual implementations of these flywheels, then it can be whatever you want, right? I mean, yeah, I think that's kind of the lesson that I'm taking here.
Yeah, I wouldn't really like marry ourselves to, okay, we have to use the MCP, we have to use brain trust, right? A lot of these are just tools. Again, like the abstraction I mostly focus on is what are these test data sets that I can preserve? Because those test data sets are language agnostic, right? I can load that question string, chunk ID pair. That's saved in Postgres. I can load that in JavaScript. I can load that in Python, right? It's just ultimately going to be what languages do people on your team feel comfortable with? And the benefit again is like with these new observability tools, before you might say, well, if I do it in pandas, I can do data analysis and visualization, but now they're usually handled by other vendors. And so even that isn't much of a constraint.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would hate to sort of have your team have like a fully JS mono repo and just some random like /evals repo on GitHub, because then what's going to happen is chances are today things are in sync, but 6 months later someone joins, someone leaves, and that maintenance of that repository is something that might fall behind. Yeah, it's like almost when you think of building a new feature, the first thing we should be thinking about ideally is to add in some evals, build a feature out. It's almost like thinking about your unit tests, right? And if you think about it that way, it wouldn't make sense to have unit tests in Python if your application is in JavaScript.
Right. So you're the type like start building your evals right alongside your feature.
Yeah.
Right from the beginning.
Yeah, like in the examples before, it's like, oh, the team says we need to have better image search. I'm gonna just hunt down the product manager and tell them to find me 50 examples of things that should be returned. I set that up, right? We already have the question image ID set up, but we don't even have a search engine yet. But then when we build one, we'll go, oh, it's like 50% accurate. This is terrible. We really have to invest a lot more effort into building this out. Yeah.
I can go next. So
Sure.
I think I've already mentioned like what I've been working on. So we are mostly working on like customer feedback analytics and building a chat application or RAG-based system on top of it. It's already live in production, but we still have it in beta. We haven't gone ahead and said it's ready for production use cases because we feel like it does mess up a lot sometimes. Like there are corner cases which we don't do a good job on, and it's a bit slow. So those things need to be addressed before we can put it in production and say, okay, this is like ready for use. But everyone has access to it, so it's like an open beta, and everyone is still using. So we do get feedback from it. The thing we are struggling with right now is like figuring out what are the issues that are happening. So I feel like we are not spending enough time looking at the data in a sense, especially in terms of like the production use cases that are happening. And that is something that was quite insightful from yesterday also, that the cross team basically spends time and just sits and goes through the production runs.
Yeah.
It was quite nice. So I was thinking that we can also adopt something similar. We could do it async or synchronous, but try to look at the data a lot more and see what's going on. Other thing I was curious about is how do you guys think about drift detection? So period of time, the user pattern change, and the questions they are expecting you to answer will change as well. So how do we build a system wherein we are able to capture those kind of nuances over a period of time?
I mean, I can try to answer a little bit only from my experience from the e-commerce side of things, where, because we had all these different scores, we would have real-time monitors of sort of the average cosign distance or the average re-ranker distance across different query segments, right? And so in the e-commerce sense, we know what the average probability of sale prediction is based on cosign distance is across multiple departments. So we just have like a time series of like, this is men's pants and this is women's dresses and this is like everything that's red and this is everything that's like down or whatever. And we would have like seasonality trends that we could monitor. And then what we just said was, okay, if there are significant jumps in that, that's one way of thinking about segmentation, thinking about drift, right? It's like, has the scores, if the model is fixed, has the scores drifted, right? And then with this work, it's like, okay, again, it's like, okay, is the average image similarity dropping over time? If that's the case, has inventory changed or are the queries different? How could we do some segmentation and figure that out and stuff like that?
And would like semantic similarity be enough, or could we like think about like LLMs as judges or something along those?
That's tough because I don't think I've built a system yet where we've successfully identified like a significant piece of drift, right? Like we basically only notice things when we add new features and we can see that like with a new feature, usage of a different time has been cannibalized. Because like with cosign distance, really you would only really detect sort of catastrophic changes in your system. Yeah. I think it's like the cosine distance for OpenAI Ada 3 is like 0.7 plus or minus 0.2. That's kind of variance, right? So
Yep.
I think more importantly, regardless of what score you're using, it's likely going to be more important to think about what segments are we slicing up the data. But Dan, I don't know if you have any thoughts. I feel like you're the expert here on drift.
Yeah, I mean, I have a few thoughts. So one is the one I'll give you the least satisfying one last. That's probably the most important one. The first thing, which is sort of actionable, is to look at shift in the distribution of how many queries are landing in each of the segments. And if you see that shift, then that tells you that there's probably a change in other underlying factors as well. To go back to the analogy for classical ML, for classical ML, in many circumstances, especially where it takes a long time for the ground truth value to come in, so you make a prediction and then you don't see whether that was accurate or inaccurate for some period of time, we typically look at covariate shift or shift in the distribution basically of the x's. And actually, like, that shouldn't matter. If you see that the x is like, we used to have a lot of people who applied for a loan that were low credit score, but now there's more people with high credit score. Like, that in and of itself shouldn't matter. Really, what you should care about is, does the y conditional on the x change? And we always did some like incredibly hand wavy thing of saying, if we have covariate shift, then we think that the data generating process for the Ys has probably shifted too, but there's nothing rigorous about that. And you could also have the data generating process of the Ys shift even with the covariates not shifting. And so everything that we do is really just proxies for the things we care about, and proxies that aren't that good, or we just use our intuition about whether they're good or not. And I think that we would have found that very dissatisfying. And the only reason that we thought that monitoring covariate shift was typically good enough was in a lot of cases there actually wasn't that much you could do. You're not going to take your model out of production. So my real question is, you want to detect data drift to what ends? Is it so that you can retrain your model more frequently? If retraining a model or updating your re-ranker is cheap and easy enough, you're probably doing that pretty frequently anyway. And so if you're saying we're going to detect data drift, but we're not sure what we're going to actionably do about it, then I think, say we've got a couple of proxies. In our case, average distance is actually a quite good proxy, but then shift in what segments we're observing is a kind of crappy proxy, but it's some proxy. And then say like, we're just going to keep an eye on those, but we can't do that much about it anyway. I would view that as good enough.
Yeah. I guess the only time I look at covariate shift, especially in the startup sense, is just when it's like, as a startup, you're just growing very fast. You're aggressively just trying to figure out who wants to use your product. And so the covariate shift is just like, did we onboard like an interesting cohort that might tell us to potentially build in a different direction? Or are they using the proxy in a way that is not the direction that we care about, and we need to sort of fix that, right? One of the examples was like, I think, yeah, we onboarded a bunch of founders for free, and they were using the tool, but in a very different way than we wanted sort of the regular folks to use it. And so we had to say, okay, let's ignore their counts and distributions of things because they're not really paying for the product the way that we want our customers to use the product.
Interesting.
If you're very early stage, then it's not that you have so much growth and you're just adding new cohorts. And then after you observe what you've added, you're going to build more functionality for them. You probably very frequently, if you're very early stage, at any given moment, you have very few returning customers, and you instead have a hypothesis about who you want to support next. And then even before you have data for them, you're just going to build out like, here's the thing that we think we need in order to even get them to try out the platform. And now, yeah, you could kind of sort of look at data drift, but you just actually are relying on your intuition about drift that hasn't happened yet to proactively
Build those parts.
build what you think they're going to want so that you can test whether you can get them on board.
Another interesting idea I just thought of was we could also like start looking at product metrics. Like we capture things like how many people are copying our responses or how many people are interacting with the responses. And then basically the percentage, if that starts to fall off, then that could also suggest like there is a drift happening or something is basically not working as it should be. that was also something that I thought might be an interesting approach towards building something that can help us monitor this.
Yeah, ultimately it's going to just be group by segment, count queries,
Yeah.
like mean and variance, cosine distance, and then maybe probability of engagement. Maybe that's a thumbs up, maybe that's a copy paste. But I think those are kind of the only three. Like again, most of the work is in the segmentation. I feel like you guys would be experts in that given the nature of the product.
Not yet. We haven't really spent enough time segmenting our cohorts yet. Initial focus was like just getting to a place where the product was working and everything was like white checks and just building on top of that. And then now that the product is at a place that we feel comfortable with it, so now we are investing more towards how do we scale it over a period of time now? What is our roadmap for the next year or 2 years? Instead of just focusing on okay, the MVP should come out and
I really think there's a lot of possibilities if you start thinking about like, because in the ramp example, we talked about like transaction embeddings. Right?
Yeah.
I bet there's a world where you can sort of start fine tuning like feedback embeddings and then see
Right.
if any kind of like hierarchical clustering will be helpful. So like I did this kind of stuff in like 16, 17, where we were embedding both product images and product feedback. And sometimes you can find like some reasonable clusters across time that says like, oh, it just seems that like everyone's complaining about the buttons on this jacket, right? Oh, they
Right.
messed up something in manufacturing. Like this leather jacket is just like very low quality or you get stuck a lot. So we could identify those topics. What we didn't have at that time was the ability to name topics, right? Because we were just using like LDA and
Yeah.
PCA to factor matrices. I think now there is a possibility where if you discover 400 clusters in some hierarchical way, I'm surprised there's not more literature on sort of naming clusters these days. But
Makes sense actually. So we already do something similar for feedback. We could
Yeah.
apply a similar pipeline for our queries as well, wherein we cluster them, then try to identify like groupings of clusters and create a hierarchy out of that. Then that should help us segment those into which of these buckets are we actually serving right now, and which
Exactly.
of these buckets should we invest into actually going forward. Interesting.
Yeah, and then what we did was we just took these embedding models, got the embeddings, and then just trained XGBoost to predict some kind of critique or issues. Like, oh, was this a merchandising issue? Was it a delivery issue? Was this a product issue? Quality, fit, all that stuff. We ended up doing quite well, but it is hard to sort of make embeddings reliable because then you end up like when you retrain models, how do you make sure the embeddings don't drift, or how do you like lock in? We're just kind of trading one problem for another.
Yeah. So for like embedding issues, what we have tried to do is integrate LLMs and embeddings as well. So like the clusters we create are like reviewed by LLMs.
Yeah.
So that the actual output of the cluster is a lot better compared to just relying on embedding solely, because embeddings have a lot of noise. So it doesn't make sense to rely just solely on them.
Yeah. One tip, which was really important for us when I was managing human labelers, is it is a bad idea to ask a human to label a single cluster because the labels become incredibly generic.
Right.
And so what you have to do is you have to create labeling jobs where you use humans to tell you what is different across clusters, right? Because if you had just one cluster, maybe the comment is like, these are shirts, and then cluster 2 is also shirts.
Right.
But if you find two similar clusters and you say, tell me what differentiates them, it might become, oh, these are plain patterns and these are more colorful patterns, and these are small patterns with big patterns. And so I bet in your prompt engineering, there might be a world where instead of doing like a single cluster at a time, not to say that that's what you're doing, but trying to distill out differences between clusters, because you're likely going to get much more like high entropy labels.
I haven't tried that
thing that
drove
me
we haven't
for like
tried
4
that.
months.
Interesting.
Faraj, I don't know if you're able to speak right now, but if you have any thoughts on the question.
Hi guys, I work with Vaibhav itself
okay.
in Interpret. Yeah, so I'm just listening right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff to do with embedding models. You can always just run a TS&E plot and impress your boss.
We are at the stage of building the probability of success of queries equation that we had showed, right? We are trying to build the evals on top of it. So we have this, as Vaibhav mentioned, we have the rack pipeline and we have a lot of components over there. So we're trying to measure how well each of the component is doing so that we can iterate on and try to improve each of those components individually. So most of my work deals with building evals right now.
Have you been convinced by Vitor to make the buttons bigger and start doing labeling parties?
Yeah.
The buttons bigger is still a product decision. We can't really push too hard on that, but we do plan on another idea that we have had is that we can go ahead and give to users the option to, instead of sharing feedback as a text, you can just speak and we'll record that.
That's tough.
And then let's see how the adoption changes. And we can transcribe and share that with you if you want to make any edits or something, and then submit that. So make the process of actually providing feedback a lot easier and see if people start leveraging that a bit more. Right now, the percent of feedback we get is around like 0.1%, 0.2%. It's like barely anything. You get like 1 or 2 feedback per day. So not really helpful right now.
Yeah. I think copywriting is going to be such a huge impact on your ability to get the feedback well. Like, what is the copyright now?
We haven't really spent time on that. Right now, the copy is just a thumbs up and thumbs down. That to like right next to the answer. So
Yeah.
like similar to how ChatGPT does it. So we took a lot of inspirations from there and designed it way back, like 8 months back now. Like, not 8 months, 6 months back. It has been the same since. We are planning to invest on that a bit more, but we also don't want to make it very aggressive because then the users might start to feel ki, why is it all in my face all the time? So we want to find a middle ground, which gives us like a bit more feedback as well. But product also needs to be happy.
Gotta A/B test that. I don't know. I feel like
Yeah.
if I can 5x the amount of data, I'm okay with. I'm making some sacrifices to get that feedback.
Let's see. Product decision is also there now. Like we need to get the buy-in from product team. Okay, this is something that you can do. So that in itself will be a battle we'll have to fight, but we'll try to get it done and see what will be the best trade-offs we can make there. We are also rethinking like how the application itself should be designed, because what we have noticed is that our platform lends not as much towards chat but towards dashboards. So it might be better for our application to, like Hex has an approach of creating dashboards. We could also learn from them and basically build an application wherein you can create dashboards using chat. So that could be another approach of doing it. We're still like figuring out what is the best solution for our use cases.
Yeah. I'm curious if there's any kind of like favoriting mechanism or like show more similar feedback mechanism that could just like get you to get more clicks.
Yes, that is actually a feature request that has been there for a while, and we actually have built it like recently. Last week only I built it, and we are still figuring out the latency trade-offs there. But what we are doing is basically that given a set of records, you can ask for more similar feedback, and we'll try to like look at the corpus and get you like more feedback so that you can leverage that in your research.
Yeah. Because that's an example where you can sort of do the same kind of UI tricks as like the people you may know, where maybe if you want to see similar, we show you 10 things, you have to add them,
Right.
but if you want to see more things, you have to like delete them to see more. It's like there's
Yeah.
because
So
if you were to do that, you're going to go from 2 a day to like 1,000 a day, right?
Yep, exactly. So what we are thinking is that we give them an option to basically get suggestions, and then you can choose which of these suggestions are actually relevant for you. So you add those to your collection, while the rest get discarded. And that way, basically, the positive and negative both we get feedback on. And these were the positive ones that got accepted, and the rest got rejected.
Totally makes sense. Cool. Yeah, I guess actually no, I don't think I have a question. I was gonna ask about fine tuning, but I think that's maybe too far from what most people are working on.
So adding to that, actually, we had tried fine tuning our components, right? In the RAG pipeline, we started off with fine tuning. We built synthetic queries, created some answers to them, and then tried to fine tune a model, but that didn't really go well for us. And then when the GPT-4 pricings dropped down, we were like, let's try to use off-the-shelf models itself. And then now we are on the journey, like once we have these models in production and we are getting a lot of user data, we are started thinking of using that data and fine-tuning models on top of it, in the sense that we can build an evaluator LLM and try to evaluate the responses that we already have in production, only fine-tune on the ones which are right, which the eval LLM says they're right, and get the model in production. So actually, we had a very similar journey to what Zapier Vitor mentioned yesterday. Like when there was GPT-4o, whether we need to swap our models with GPT-4 or not. So that was a big question for us as well. And that's when we realized that building evals for each of those components is very crucial for us, because in this LLM space, every now and then there will be a new model coming up, and there will be always a question of whether we should use that or not. So yeah, we are taking a step back. Some of the folks are working on evals, some folks are working on building new features. So that's the journey right now.
Yeah, and also like I think building the evals and building the new features almost is very aligned, right? If you think about how, for example, Hex builds their products, the evals are actually part of the project and feature requirements, right? So like in the proposal doc, there's kind of like, what is the product for? Who's the user? What's the user story? And as part of that, they have to produce, the PMs have to produce evals and examples to demonstrate what the actual requirements of the product look like. And so making that cultural shift also has been very useful for a lot of the companies I've spoken to. So I think, yeah, like with Zapier, like when I was working with them, it really was just like, oh, we need to make RAG better. But it took a long time to really figure out, like, let's split this out into multiple subproblems. And then which subproblem should we tackle first and how do we prioritize that kind of work? Very, very enlightening.
Yeah, like even the thing that Vito mentioned, wherein they moved from a normal agent to a planner. Same thing we did. We had like a very normal agent wherein it was just planning on the fly and figuring out, okay, given these tools, what to do, to a planner, because the agent itself was like very non-deterministic. Planner still became a little more deterministic in nature. But now the problem with planner is it doesn't really interact with the user. It just plans without looking at the users, without interacting with them. So how do we make sure that it is able to ask questions, then basically get feedback from the user, and leverage it? Something we are still trying to figure out. This makes me ask one question as well. What kind of tools do you think are necessary for a planner to be actually able to plan properly? So like the user's queries can be very ambiguous. They might be missing details. And how does it basically figure out, okay, this is something that I need more information on before I go ahead and plan my execution?
That's hard because I don't even know if I have a full taxonomy of all the different kind of failure modes. It's like
Yeah.
some of the smaller subproblems I've been looking at are just at Zapier, for example, we were just trying to measure how often is the language model selecting the right columns, right? It's like,
Right.
is there some kind of like precision recall on not only tables, but columns and code snippets, right? And then the question is like, okay, again, if it's a failure, like if we can't answer this question, can we identify whether it's inventory in the sense that we just don't have the column? Or is it because of like in Zapier's example, I saw examples where just column names are not specific enough. And so what we lacked was just descriptions for those columns.
Got it.
I don't really have my full theory of like what it means to not know or not have, sorry, I don't have a like what is underspecified. But that is something I'm trying to work on and see if we can just break it down into like 5 categories that we can just evaluate. But I'm still a little bit far away from that.
And one thing I was thinking about is that what we could try to do is give the player an option of basically interacting with the user directly as well. Then if it feels like that, given the plans that I've seen, that these are the details I would need to actually answer a similar question, then let me go ahead and ask the user or perform a search for this particular thing that I'm missing. So it could be that you are interacting with the user. It could be that you're interacting with the data, underlying data itself as well, that you don't normally get access to because you are not sure what to do here. I'm not sure whether the planner would be smart enough to pick that or not. That is something we'll have to experiment on, but would be something interesting to experiment with and see how that works out.
Most of what I've seen there has been sort of reasoning about the nodes as kind of like forms you fill out, right? And the question is, okay, how many forms are optional versus how many of those attributes are required? And if they're required and they're missing, is there any way that we can fill in those things? And then if they're optional, does the form processing, is it able to communicate the fact that, okay, if this attribute was not, if the attribute is optional, your results could be better if they were present, right? But again, that's kind of like my like glimpse into sort of figuring out what the categories of failures are. But is it a missing mechanism, like analogy? I'm not really sure. Dan, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but
yeah, I feel like this is an area that we're still trying to figure out.
Yeah, my goal is I just want to have like a 3x3 like chart that says like it's either this, that. But because we have that in like standard data science, like there is like a missing mechanism, right? Is it null at random? Is there a mechanism that induces the nullness? Like we have some notions, so we just gotta rederive it for this LLM case.
Something to experiment with for us. That is something we do want to spend some time on. How do we improve the planning?
Yeah, I'll keep thinking about this like missing mechanism stuff. It hasn't been like the highest priority. But did anyone else have any other questions? I know we mostly just had like a conversation today, but cool. All right. As always, if you have any other questions, feel free to like post in the Slack, ask instructor, and yeah, otherwise you can like DM us for anything more specific. Awesome.
Thank you guys for staying up late.
You
No
got it.
problem.
Thanks,
No
folks.
problem. Take care.
Thanks a
everyone.
lot. Okay, bye.